Afternoon to everyone. Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to greet you here for for this event. And it's my honor not just to welcome you and our panel, but also our online participants. We have over probably 300 people online. So we really hope that we can do justice to presenting this report, both to the audience in person and online. So as you know, this is the launch of our report on turning the tide on internal displacements, a development approach to solutions. We really consider this as an important step forward. And as our administrator, Mr. Rahim Steiner, has said, the world is facing a global crisis of internal displacement, to which we may not pay as much attention as some other issues, but actually they are quite significant, with over 59 million people who remained forcibly displaced within their own countries at the end of 2021 due to conflict, violence, disasters, climate change, an all-time high for this particular problem. That was before the war in Ukraine, where 6.5 million people are now estimated to be internally displaced as well. By 2050, climate change alone could force more than 216 million people to move within their own countries. 216 million. That is a huge number, and the recent COP27 in Egypt devoted attention to this important link between climate change and displacement as well. We know that internally displaced people can live for years without adequate access to basic services, to social protection, decent work, unable to exercise their full rights as citizens, and be agents of progress for their own communities. The marginalization of IDPs hinders long-term peace, stability, and recovery, and constitutes a major obstacle to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's why today, together with the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, we'd like to present a new report that argues that in tandem with critical humanitarian assistance, there is an enormous need to place a renewed emphasis on development as the only way to provide sustainable solutions to internal displacement and build pathways towards peace and stability. This is in line with the recommendations issued by the UN Secretary General's high-level panel report on internal displacement, and a key tenet to the UN Secretary General's action agenda on internal displacement. So as I mentioned at the beginning, today we have a hybrid event. We have a global audience from the displacement, humanitarian and development communities, together with internal displacement impacted countries and donors joining us here in the room in Geneva as well. So warm welcome to all of you. And let me just quickly run through the agenda of today. We will start with a presentation on the report by Ms. Asako Okai, UN Assistant Secretary General and the Director of UNDP's Crisis Bureau from New York, which will be followed by an intervention from Ms. Alessandra Bilag, the Director of the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, and the panel discussion with distinguished members of the panel, including Mr. Robert Piper, the UN Secretary General's Special Advisors on Solution to Internal Displacements, and representatives from Colombia, Germany, and Nigeria. So without further ado, let me pass the floor to Ms. Asako Okai, who will share some thoughts on the report with us.
Thank you, Aggie. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is great pleasure to visit you today to present the findings of this timely report just outlined by my colleague Aggie. I would like to thank Mr. Robert Piper, the Secretary General's Special Advisor on Solutions to International Displacement, and representatives of Colombia, Germany, and Nigeria on our panel, together with partners and participants who are with us physically today. I also want to acknowledge the invaluable contribution of the International Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC, and express my gratitude for their collaboration on this important work. I'm so happy that Alexandra is here with us today. The product of that work represents a fundamental step forward in the implementation of the recommendation of the report of the high-level panel on IDPs and then the Secretary General Action Agenda on internal displacement, which both highlight the need for a more developmental approach to internal displacement. I'd like to use the slides to aid me in presentation. On our report, Turning the Tide on Internal Displacement, a development approach to solutions precisely calls for renewed emphasis on what we call development solutions. Through UNDP's new analysis of data provided by IDMC, we looked at the socio-economic impacts of the internal displacement on individuals and affected host communities in some of the most fragile and protracted settings. What we found was a long overdue need for greater investment in development out of crisis and displacement. As the report makes clear, humanitarian assistance is critical in the first stages of displacement to save lives and foster stability. But development holds the key to long-term solutions. Our report connects the dots between available data and proven solutions to paint a clear picture of the actions that governments, national actors, and development partners must take to prevent displacement, protect those forced to move, and offer them opportunities to integrate and contribute to the economies and societies of the host communities. With this report, we hope to contribute to lifting the veil of indifference that has led to the marginalization of entire generations of internally displaced persons. This year, as a report, please go on to the next slide. This year, as reported by UNHCR, the global number of forcibly displaced people passed 100 million mark for the first time. For many, the displacement conjures images of refugees crossing international borders. Yet most people fleeing from their homes, almost 60 million in fact, remain within their own countries. In Ukraine alone, more than 14 million people have now been forced from their homes, with 6.5 million people displaced within the country. Globally, IDPs have doubled over the past decade, disproportionately affecting women, children, marginalized groups. And some 80% are hosted in fragile settings, according to the OECD DAC fragility figures. The analysis in the Turning the Tide report comes from data collected by IDMC between January 2021 and January 2022 from people both internally displaced and from within host communities across 8 countries, namely Colombia, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Nepal, Nigeria, Papua New Guinea, Somalia, and Vanuatu. These data, while not nationally representative, can provide insights in the absence of national and global estimates and reveal a series of distinct development deficits. We found a third of IDPs surveyed fell into unemployment. 68% didn't have enough money to meet their household's need, and a third said their health had worsened. Compared to members of host populations, displaced children were on average 28% more likely to have stopped going to school. This lack of integration harms individuals and the localities that host them simultaneously. IDPs themselves are unable to rebuild their lives while communities fail to benefit from the work, knowledge, and skills these individuals can offer. The resulting divisions invariably lead to distrust in local institutions, increased inequality and instability. It is a volatile mix of fragile conditions that on our current course, we will see expand in the coming decades. As has been already highlighted by Agi, as climate change intensifies, the World Bank estimates upward of 216 million people could be forced to move internally by 2050. And yet, these events rarely make headlines. Gaps in development support have led to invincible crisis hiding in plain sight. Excellencies, distinguished participants, these findings supply important evidence for the effectiveness, value, and sustainability of nationally owned and locally led development solutions to protracted displacement. Turning the tide emphasizes the urgent need for investment in people-centered approaches to basic services and pathways to integration. Too often, these efforts have come in the form of humanitarian interventions that stop short of addressing root causes. As in any crisis, internal displacement requires long-term integrated and gender-responsive development solutions that help countries break the cycle of fragility, get ahead of the crisis curve, and sustain development to invest in hope from jobs to justice. With this type of systems lens in mind, the report suggests 5 key pathways to development solutions. They focus on people, their opportunities, and choices to outline what the end of displacement looks like. Through a human development approach, we propose to renew the social contract between displaced citizens and the state. Restoring their human security and dignity should be at the heart of rebuilding equity and a prosperous society. The first pathway is about strengthening governance institutions at national, local levels. This implies incorporating internal displacement into national and local development plans. It is also about capacitating, reinforcing, and building resilient institutions to lead, coordinate, and respond to their own citizens' needs. The second pathway focuses on fostering the socio-economic integration or reintegration of IDPs and displacement affected communities through access to healthcare, education, employment, and social protection, among others. Third, we must improve the security of IDPs and displacement affected communities by supporting governments and national actors in restoring the rule of law and access to justice, while joining forces with stabilization and peace actors to foster a return to peace. Fourth, enhancing IDP's civic and political participation means we must address exclusion by safeguarding IDP's full rights as citizens and residents of their own countries. The fifth pathway focuses on promoting social cohesion in displacement affected communities to prevent conflict and foster peaceful coexistence. We have put forward this new development solutions framework to support member states to achieve an end to displacement through development approaches. Our report also illustrates the proven success that is possible through these pathways. We have many examples I put up in the slide, but I will pick up 2 situations relevant to this panel today. In northeast Nigeria, where the UN and European Union have worked with government partners to build energy efficient housing and restoration of basic services in the communities. Thousands of families have returned home after a decade of conflict and instability. In a subsequent survey of the region, 89% of community households reported satisfaction with government performance. In Colombia, with strong community engagement, IDPs have been able to engage in the peace process, ensuring their voices are included in development plans. Helping repair the social contract, UNDP has strengthened local government capacities to implement victim reparation schemes, promote income generation and facilitate returns and relocation. Distinguished participants, earlier this year, as the UN Secretary General called for development approaches to displacement, he said, more of the same is not good enough. UNDP agrees. With this report, we offer our vision for a better approach and to begin a conversation towards a more common understanding of how the end of displacement can look like from a development perspective. And UNDP stands ready to do our part. As core members of the UN Steering Group on Solutions to Internal Displacement, we will support the mandate of the special advisors and promote a more joined-up approach to solutions globally and in countries. We commit to supporting the role of UN resident coordinators in leading UN efforts on the ground and have agreed with a special advisor to host a UN facility for the provision of additional support to RCs and UN country teams. We will consolidate our collaboration with humanitarian partners. For example, during the High Commissioner's dialogue next week in Geneva, we will unveil a new global collaboration framework with UNHCR, focusing on inclusion and solutions. We will strengthen our partnership with IDMC and the Joint IDP Profiling Services, JIPS, and other entities to devise better data and analytics to enhance our understanding of the longer-term impacts of internal displacement. These strengthened data and analytics are intended to support decision-making and to monitor progress toward the implementation of development solutions. We will invest in internal capacities through staff training and guidance tools to leverage our broad development mandate and the wide range of in-house expertise. UNDP commit to work with governments willing to champion the cause of IDPs and adopt national solution strategies, and call for development partners, especially multilateral development banks, to support such effort. All this will be outlined in our new UNDP strategy on supporting development solutions to internal displacement. Distinguished participants, the report of the high-level panel and the action agenda of the UN Secretary General provide a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reframe and reset our collective approach and effectively turn the tide on internal displacement. Let's work together to make this ambition a reality. Just as no one is immune to forced displacement, no one can solve it alone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Asako, for presenting the report. And of course, the purpose of today's event is just to give you a little bit of a summary and a little bit of an update on what the report is saying, but you all have it in front of you and you can see it's a lean report. So we try to be to the point and really focus on the issues and the recommendations and especially the way forward. And as Asako said, we cannot do this. No entity can do this without good partnerships. So for this report and beyond, of course, we are partnering across the UN system and other organizations that are focusing on the issues. So with that, I'd like to invite Ms. Alexandra Bilak, who is the director of IDMC, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, who has decades of experience on the topic and who was also on the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on internal displacement. So Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Aggie, and thank you very much, Asako, and congratulations to UNDP on launching this important report. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be with you today, and it was an honor for IDMC to be approached by UNDP over a year ago, I think, and we were I think first and foremost, very happy to see UNDP rising to the challenge of articulating what a development approach to internal displacements could look like. We were asked in particular to advise on what kind of data and evidence is already available out there to support this agenda. And of course, we shared all the data and the evidence that IDMC itself has been collecting over the last few years. And in all honesty, there isn't much data, at least within IDMC. We looked through all of our publications, and even at IDMC's level, our ambition to start capturing the longer term effects of internal displacement and really shifting this narrative away from a purely humanitarian one towards a more development one is something that we only started doing a few years ago. Back in the day, we had been approached even by a few of our donors who'd asked us to help them shift the narrative, help them make that business case. And of course, in the process, also help advance concrete and effective approaches to durable solutions. So what we did in collaboration with UNDP was just to look at what is out there and to try and document a little bit more systematically where the gaps lie. Before I go into the details of that, I just wanted to share. I've just come back from the Philippines, where I spent last week. I met with all our governments, with government counterparts, with the UN country team there, who's gearing up and preparing to support Robert Piper in advancing solutions there. We also met with the Asian Development Bank, and of course the topic of conversation was on durable solutions to internal displacement. And some of the key questions that came up, I think, are going to resonate with all of you. But it was very clear that the same questions came up in most of the conversations that I had. There was a very top line question, which was, how much does it cost? What is the cost of internal displacement for the government of the Philippines, for the people themselves, for communities, for local governments? And can we make a financial argument to as part of this business case and to push this up the government's priority list? Now, once we passed that initial question about financial cost, there were then a bit more precise questions about, where are some of the key hotspots when it comes to needs and vulnerabilities, and not just kind of geographic hotspots, but demographic hotspots. Who is most affected by internal displacement? What do we know about what happens to women or children or people with disabilities when they're displaced, following a typhoon? What do we know about people who aren't evacuated as part of an official evacuation process and who don't end up in an evacuation center, those who will move into, for example, urban areas and who will typically fall off the radar screen? What do we even know about them and about their needs? What do we know about how those needs evolve over time, when we all know and we can all see it's a known fact, it's not just in a conflict context, but also in a disaster context, that displacement tends to become protracted. It doesn't get resolved in a matter of days or weeks. And those needs are bound to change as time moves on and as the context evolves as well. What do we know about the kind of longer term evolution? And then, of course, there were questions about that were more about policy. What kind of existing policy frameworks at the national level, at the regional level, can we actually leverage to advance solutions to displacement rather than reinventing the wheel or creating new frameworks? The Asian Development Bank, for example, is looking at the issue of internal displacement from the perspective of fragility and looking at how they can incorporate it as a component within the fragility framework. There were lots of questions about some of the outcomes of COP27. Where does displacement sit when we think about loss and damage? Can we actually leverage policy discussions and even financing mechanisms under loss and damage to approach this issue? There were even, suggestions that, for example, the Philippines has a database that captures the poorest of the poor, literally in the country, and how many of the people who are in that database are actually IDPs, and can we help advance their needs through that database and that poverty reduction strategy? So anyway, so those were some of the questions that that were at the forefront of our minds throughout the days that I spent in Manila. So I'll come back to some of them, but basically now to come back to what IDMC did in the context of this partnership. So when UNDP approached us, we looked at what we had and what we shared, and I think it's already been shared with all of you. We've published this this evidence over the last few years, but the first ambition that we had was to try and answer that question about the cost. We thought that would be the most straightforward, starting point. If we could actually put a price tag on internal displacement, maybe that would be a compelling argument for mobilizing more development support and for, in a sense, taking the burden away from the humanitarians and mobilizing more financial, political, technical support for it. So we back in 2019, we started assessing the global cost of internal displacement and its impact on different development sectors. And we quickly came across a huge data barrier, because in order to assess that cost in a very precise way, you would need a lot of data on a lot of different development indicators over a very long period of time, which of course doesn't exist, and certainly not at the global level for all the countries in the world. So what we did was we had to use proxy indicators. We relied on data coming from OCHA's humanitarian needs assessments, and we also used some of the World Bank data. And what we only looked at, we were only able to look at the direct cost of providing support and assistance to IDPs in the first year of their displacement. So looking at what their loss of income amounts to in 1 year of displacement, and the cost of providing support when it comes to housing, education, healthcare, and basic security. Now, the number that we came up with is just over $20 billion. It actually seems like, I don't think it does justice to the scale of the problem. It's actually a very small number. It only allowed us to start scratching the surface. But I think it did start a conversation, and it did at least, I think just by virtue of having put a number on it, it allowed us to raise more awareness of the longer term costs. Now, to complement this work, we also, as Sako mentioned, we have carried out a number of socioeconomic assessments, so deep dive case studies into certain internal displacement caseloads. So as Asako said, this is not nationally representative data, but what it does do is that it allows us to capture the very specific areas that are commonly affected when we're looking at protracted internal displacement caseload. So across those 12 assessments, we've looked at impacts on livelihoods, on income, education, health, and some of the data that Asako presented is what's captured in those assessments. What we've also done is try to look at what internal displacement means also when we think about the slogan, leave no one behind. So trying to kind of mirror a little bit what is being tracked in the SDG framework, who is most at risk, who's most affected, and who is really at risk of not just becoming displaced over a long period of time, but literally being forgotten by social safety nets, by protection and assistance from governments and from the international community. And this we've done through case study work into the differentiated impacts of displacement on different population groups. We've looked at young people and children. You'll recall last year's global report was focused on children and youth. We've looked at the impacts of internal displacement in different contexts on women and young girls. And we're just about to launch tomorrow a report on people with disabilities and how they're affected as well by internal displacement. Now, so just a few words on why these studies, or how these studies are useful beyond building a narrative and beyond kind of shifting that narrative away from a humanitarian one to a more development one. I think first and foremost, they show the impacts that internal displacement can have on progress towards the SDGs. For example, through access to quality education, decent work, physical and mental health. And I think they make the case, at least, and they give a little bit more flavor to this notion of leaving no one behind. And they allow us to at least demonstrate that IDPs in many contexts are those most at risk of being left behind. The second way in which they're useful is, and I think almost more importantly, they actually provide a baseline on which one can build and should start building national and subnational durable solution strategies. I think they can produce not just a baseline, but they can also help develop progress indicators per sector, because they do at least track how internal displacement is affecting those sectors independently. And then the third way in which I think they're useful, and I would argue that that's probably the most important way, is that they, I think, can provide very critical entry points for a constructive dialogue with governments around solutions. I think they can inform the political choices that governments are going to have to make or are already making when it comes to choosing where to make their investments. And I think that is the opportunity that we need to capitalize on. And it's not just IDMC doing that work. There are lots of partners in this room and probably online today who are contributing to this agenda through data, through new evidence. I'm thinking about GIPS in particular, that actually supports, collaborative data collection exercises and very much advances these dialogues with country level partners and governments in particular. And I think this is where the opportunity is going to lie in the future. So, in terms of what's next and what awaits us all. I think from our perspective at IDMC, there are two key things. One is we're going to, of course, continue filling these data gaps. I mean, this is very much part of our mandate. And as I said, there is a lot of data out there, but there are a lot of gaps. And just to come back to the example of the Philippines, we often use the Philippines as a model example of data when it comes to disaster displacement data in particular. The government has invested a lot. They have very strong data collection systems and databases that track the number of people who are displaced by particular disaster events over the course of a year. And yet, even in the Philippines, we were presented with all the constraints that the government currently faces. When you consider that they monitor people who are displaced following a typhoon, and then another typhoon hits. So they stop monitoring that particular caseload and they have to start monitoring a new one. And that is basically the story of their life on an annual basis. So when we came in and said, where's your solutions relevant data? Do you have any data on people who were displaced by Typhoon Haiyan almost 10 years ago? The answer was no. We don't have that data, or at least we don't have it at the national level. Maybe the local government units have that data, and I'm assuming that they probably do, but that data isn't somehow being centralized and aggregated up to the national level. So there's a massive blind spot there when it comes to protracted disaster displacement in the Philippines. So if that's the case in the Philippines, one can only imagine how many other data gaps are in the rest of the world. So in order to fill those data gaps, it's going to mean overcoming a certain number of barriers. There are some logistical barriers that are involved, of course, when it comes to access, security, etc. In the Philippines, we're talking like a large territory. We've got the Mindanao caseload, and as I said, different typhoons hitting different parts of the country. So logistical barriers. There are also institutional barriers. As I said, a huge disconnect between the local and the national. And I think I would argue that many of these discussions around operationalizing the nexus and finding a development approach to internal displacement has to come through a localization agenda and much more support at the local level, with the capacity support and financial support and political support to municipalities. And as I said, the barriers are also financial as well as technical. The second way, and then I am going to end, the second way in which we at IDMC would like to continue collaborating with UNDP and our partners on this agenda is very much about helping advance one of the key recommendations that was made by the high-level panel on internal displacement, which was to equip governments with the right kinds of data, tools, and systems to really advance nationally owned solutions to this issue. This has to be about national ownership and leadership. And this has to be about the international community rallying around those governments and providing them with the tools that they need. And there are lots of opportunities for collaboration and for providing that kind of support. As I mentioned, we're working with the Asian Development Bank, and we'll be piloting in 2 countries next year, looking at the types of development financing mechanisms that can be leveraged, but also looking at how internal displacement indicators can be effectively incorporated into national development planning. And I imagine that there'll be a lot of lessons learned from this process that we can share. There's an opportunity to collaborate with IOM, who's been rolling out solutions and mobility indices across several countries over the last few years. Again, a lot of lessons to be learned from that process, and from developing context-specific and country-specific indicators with a view to supporting governments and supporting a UN country team in developing national durable solution strategies. And of course, we look forward to working with UNDP and operationalizing what has been presented in this report as essentially a conceptual framework for understanding development approaches through a human development lens to displacement, but how can we take that now to the operational level and really put some meat on the bone? So thank you very much for inviting us into this process, and really looking forward to the next steps. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. And thank you for making the link so clearly between the analysis and the importance of data to the recommendations and the policy framework. And then what is extremely important is then how that translates at the country level. And you mentioned the examples of the Philippines, and our panelists will speak to this. I think when we look forward, that's the key of how operationalization can happen within these frameworks. And we'd like to learn a little bit from the experiences on the field as well. So with that, we'll move on to the panel discussions with some of our distinguished panelists. And if I can just kindly ask to try to fit within the frameworks of about 5 to 6 minutes from each panelists, so that we can really take advantage of all the contributions and the rich discussions that hopefully will follow. First, we have our panelists partially online and partially in the room. So first, I'd like to invite Mr. Robert Piper, who is the UN Secretary General's Special Advisor on Solutions to Internal Displacement, and probably doesn't need a lot of introductions to most of you. Robert, do we have you online?
I hope so. I hear you, Aggie.
Great. Yes, very good. We can hear you perfectly as well. So we'd really like to hear from you, especially on the key challenges to supporting more predictable engagements of development actors in solutions to internal displacement, and also to share your perspective from your new role and the priority actions that are required from the perspective that you're looking at. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Aggie. Let me just start at the very beginning with a big word of congratulations, really, both to UNDP and to IDMC. The Secretary General has asked all of us to step up our efforts to address solutions for internal displacement, and particularly for the development system to step forward. And I'm really delighted to see this report, this collaboration, the data that it provides, even with the gaps that Alexandra mentioned. So really, firstly, just a big thank you and a congratulations to the team for stepping up to the challenge. I've been asked to talk about challenges and early actions. Let me offer you 4 kind of key challenges I see in terms of increasing this development engagement, and 4 actions that can be addressed to try and reverse, or to try and make things happen. First challenge, absolutely critical, and Alexandra mentioned it, is this importance of government ownership and government leadership. And I'm really happy. I think we hear from Mr. Ohanma and Mr. Londoño after me. I think the most important speakers are on this panel. Nothing substitutes for government leadership on solutions. Only government can provide security. Only government can make some of the political choices that need to be made around solutions that are profoundly complex and sensitive. Only government can set the development priorities. Without government leadership and clarity that this is a priority, the funding from the development side simply will not follow. So I think number 1 challenge is just to make sure where we have protracted displacement, or even short-term displacement, we have government leadership, government ownership. This is fundamental. Second challenge is scale, both big and small. And let me explain. In contexts where the numbers are so large, Syria or Somalia, of course, this requires a tremendous amount of resources, energy and attention from all of the partners, and a government that's obviously stretched with lots of other challenges as well. But let's also remember that in some of the very smaller contexts where we have numbers under maybe 100,000 like Libya or the Philippines, the smallness in a sense of the group is also part of the challenge, because you need these, even with relatively small numbers, the complexity of the solutions task remains very high. And so to devote resources to what might look from a distance to be a relatively small number of people relative to, say, the total population, it really does belie the complexity behind it. So large situations, small situations, that issue of scale is a tremendous challenge for all of us. Third challenge is to get the coordination right, not just amongst the aid actors on the UN and NGO side, but also, of course, within the government, and to make sure that whatever we do is grafted onto a government-led coordination system. Really complex process solutions requiring all parts of government to come together, non-government actors to come together, the center and the local level to be aligned. That's on the government side and their partners. And then we need the UN family to come in behind that in a coordinated way. So I'm struck, as someone that spent 30 years looking at coordination systems, how complex the coordination challenge is on solutions. So that's the third. And finally, challenge financing, a big challenge in this area. Historically, huge gaps in terms of resources, in terms of the right kind of resources. We need structural funding. We need long-term funding to accompany people in their solutions. We can't solve a solutions challenge with short-term humanitarian financing, despite all the best will in the world. So it's not just volume of funding, it's also the type of funding required in order to make this work. Priority actions, let me offer 4 very briefly. I have 40 seconds left. Priority action then, of course, is the government ownership and leadership. Under the SG's action agenda, there is a proposal that governments around the globe that are affected by internal displacement host a national dialogue to bring together all of the actors at the national level, all of society, to confront this issue and to identify a path forward with a role for everyone, listening above all to IDPs themselves and what is their vision of a solution. So number 1, action, absolutely, where it hasn't happened, is these national action, these national dialogues. Number 2, action, having understood the drivers of displacement, is to act preventatively. Asako made reference to this very important analysis from the World Bank, projected movement of people, displacements due to climate change over the coming 25 years. It's critical that we act on that information and respond with our development instruments rather than allowing 200 million people to become internally displaced. We can do it. We know we have the science. We certainly have the resources, if the political will is there, to act preventatively to keep the numbers down. Number 3, to invest in data and analysis. Alexandra really made the case better than I can. She also made the point that we have big gaps in our knowledge base, and we are really handicapped as we navigate our way on solutions without very solid socioeconomic data, and governments, of course, are handicapped as well. And then finally, if I can, as an action, as the champion of the Secretary General's action agenda, let me call for everyone interested in this issue to join the action agenda. There are 31 commitments to the UN, but the action agenda belongs to everybody, governments, NGOs, our partners. It's an array of very important, I think, recommendations to bring the world together to address displacement where it is. And so I hope everyone online or in the room will make some time to look at the action agenda and look at where in the recommendations and commitments they can play a role. Thank you to all of you. I want to quote Asako as I close this, lifting the veil of indifference on internal displacement. I think it was a really superb way of capturing the challenge. And I'm really delighted this report is out now and can help us address it in the full light of day. So thank you indeed, and back to you in Geneva. I'm connecting from the OECD in Paris. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. And as always, we really appreciate how you're able to lay the land on these challenges and actions forward within a very short time frame. So that was extremely clear. And of course, we're looking forward to continuing the collaboration across all of these actors. Now, we'd like to pick up on one of the challenges that as you mentioned, and of course, one of the key actions that relate to that, which is about government ownership and government actions within the possibility of various priorities. So for that, I'd like to invite first Mr. Kingsley Ohanma, Minister Kingsley Ohanma from the Permanent Mission of Nigeria, to share with us a little bit how you see it from the government's perspective, especially in Nigeria, that what actions you took and how you took forward in terms of the mainstreaming of the agenda and the internal displacement within the government plans and priorities. And if you can share some of the good practices that are happening in Nigeria, and I think that would be inspirational to translate it down to the government action level, but also just connecting it to the action on the ground in affected countries. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel discussion. And I want to start immediately by thanking UNDP for the sterling work they've been doing in Nigeria and globally. Well, I don't know whether there's much I can say because almost everything has been mentioned by the previous speakers. But since you invited me, I think I'll just give you our experience in Nigeria. You know that Nigeria has about 3 million of this, about 60 million internally displaced people around the world. This is unacceptable. It's a burden on us in the country, on the image of the country, and so many other negatives for us. And because of this, government has been advised seriously, variously, to take development of these areas where these IDPs came from seriously. Because initially, if we really want to look at the causes of these displacements, some natural disasters owing to climate change, but we ought to have anticipated this over some time and then build some resilience into these communities. 1. 2, we have people displaced because of the terrorism and things like that, and so many that those ones too were due to some government failures and so many. So if we were going to address these issues, then we have to go to the roots of this problem. And I think the government has realized this and started taking steps in this direction. But you know that in a situation where there is insecurity, it is very difficult to do some of these development projects, implement this agenda that we have. But even at that, a lot has been going on because owing to the fact that we owe these people this duty of care as citizens of our country and displaced, not because of their own doing, but because of a breakdown in the system or things like that. Government, first of all, started with the establishment of the Northeast Development Commission. You realize that most of the displacement is in the Northeast, where we have a desert encroachment due to climate change and this terrorism. That is the hub of the terrorism. So governments, pursuant to this development approach to ending this question of IDPs, set up the Northeast Development Commission. This Northeast Development Commission is funded directly from the center, and they are supposed to intervene in all these development projects that are needed to make these people have some sense of dignity, get back their livelihoods, and be able to contribute to the development of the country. But like the previous speaker said, this issue is also bogged down with financing because we are not able to do as much as we want to do because of the downturn in the economy. COVID also had an impact on what was going on there. You realize that Nigeria depends on oil majorly for its income. And then the market has been very volatile for some time now. So receipts have been dwindling. And then in the face of so many competing needs, there is hardly much the government cannot do as much as it would have wanted. It is in this area that we are very grateful to our development partners and humanitarian partners who have been able to step in to augment the effort of government. We have been, especially when it comes to human security issues like sanitary conditions in these IDP camps, giving these people some means of livelihood or some means of doing things for themselves, and a lot of other issues like that. But we are going to an election in February. For so many reasons, this period, this election is going to be a watershed moment in the history of Nigeria, especially when it comes to development, because people have now realized that some of these problems that we have in the country, humanitarian interventions are not enough. There has to be some political will there. And I think that is what you mean by government ownership of some of these processes and things like that. The IDPs, they've all been registered. They are going to vote. In fact, they voted in the last 2 elections, so we just upgraded everything to make sure that they are included because their voices have to be heard, especially the women who are the most affected and the children. We want to make sure that what they feel counts in the next election, and I know they are going to vote wisely this time. It's not like before that people just come and then maybe one way or the other play them and then they just vote for anybody, maybe based on ethnic affiliation or so many other things like that. Those are some of the things we are doing there. Then, well, I want to limit myself to that development side because we have been having problems again with the military. They have told the military that kinetic approaches alone cannot solve this problem. There's a need for them to weave in some other approaches into solving the issue of this terrorism that has led to majority of the displacements we have in the country. Gradually, they are getting around to it. So we have started some de-radicalization programs, and then we are pursuing some prevention and counter-terrorism, counter-terrorism and extremism programs within the country there. We have succeeded a lot because a lot of these terrorists, over 80-something thousand as of September, have surrendered to government and things like that. They first of all allowed their women to come out, and we advise government that the way you treat these women will determine how many of these other ones, the men that will come out from the bushes. So once the lady, the wives and the children were settled, these people, we saw that the men started coming out of the bushes, and we were able to de-radicalize some of them, reintegrate them into the society by giving them some skills, skill acquisition. We work with the private sector, some of the telecom companies, and a lot of them, they came in and gave them some IT skills and so many, because the jobs of today need all these IT skills. So they gave some of them these IT skills, and some of them, they are doing well. They are doing well. So we want to sustain this effort so that they do not return back to their old ways, because they didn't have a means of livelihood before, or sustainable livelihood. That was why they went into the terrorism in the first place. And then if you look at the situation where the opportunity cost of not going into terrorism is very low, chances are that they might go back to those areas. So for us to build a durable peace in those areas and then sustainable development, we'll still be counting on the international community, our development partners and humanitarian partners, and particularly UNDP, because some of the data on which we are basing our plans are data that we get from you. Because some of those areas where these terrorists are operating, we're even unable to get into those territories. But humanitarian organizations like yours are able to get there. And then when you come out with this data and information, we're able to use them to do what we're supposed to do. So I want to stop there. I don't know whether I still have enough time because I had other things prepared, but since you put me on that intervention side, I just said, let me limit myself to it. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Minister Ohanma. And if you stay with us afterwards for a few minutes, we have a small reception. Perhaps people can also engage with you and benefit from your experience as well. Following this, we also have the fortune to have Sonia Lodogno online directly from Colombia, who is the Deputy General Director of the Unit for Victims of the Armed Conflict of Colombia. So she's been working on these issues for a number of years, and we'd like to ask you to give us the perspective from the government of Colombia, especially on how you're applying a whole of government approach. And just a note, Ms. Londoño will speak in Spanish. So those of you who need translation services, you have your headsets. And those online, I invite you to click on the interpretation translation services if you need that. Thank you very much. Sonia, the floor is yours. Usted tiene la palabra. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Un saludo y un agradecimiento.
Thank you very much. I'd like to just thank you very much for having invited us here to speak through this report, where we're able to basically trace new paths so as to come up with new development approaches for internally displaced people around the world. In Colombia, you know, we have included the victims of the IDPs and part of our new development plan for the country as a whole. And we want to come up with durable, sustainable solutions within the Colombian context, within the diversity that our country has and its own reality. That's to say, in terms of the diversity, ethnic diversity. We've got more than 15 indigenous peoples. We've got Afro descendants. We've got peasant farmer communities. And we have country that, due to the structural violence that we had, hasn't been able to get the state and its services to its citizens, and hasn't been able to allow them to enjoy their rights as citizens. And, you know, they've been trapped in a structure of structured poverty. You know, the poverty's been quite structural. We've had to fight against that when we come up with, you know, reformative, totally transformative new approaches. And this whole transformation is something that comes through this entire development plan from this new government, because we can't just treat the violences through the armed conflict and the displaced people if we don't see this whole global vision of these barriers that currently prevent people from accessing this development. There are certain communities of people who still don't have electricity. They still don't have access to education. They still don't have access to hospitals. And therefore, there's no reparations to be made to these people until we can first deal with those issues. And so that we can deal with the developmental part of it. And another factor that's also really important is the ongoing armed conflict. Even if in 2016, we know that the national government and the Colombian Revolutionary Armed Forces, the FARC, signed a peace agreement. This obviously reduced forced displacement, but there are still different armed groups in different areas of the country linked to drug dealing, drug trafficking, or other different interests. So not all of these groups have a national structure to them. Some are more local, and in terms of their own characteristics, they're very diverse. And so in terms of this new development plan, we're wanting total peace. And we have to understand that we have to try and get through all of these local barriers. And we have to understand the different realities and contexts of the armed actors within those particular localities, so as that we can be able to go into dialogue, as we're doing with the ELN guerrilla group and others, so as to try and prevent new internal displacement situations. And so as regards the situation of the victims, just to give you some of the context here, from the 31st of October, we've got 9,370 plus victims. We're talking about 8,530 from forced displacement. And as regards this situation of the victims, the Constitutional Court in 2015 had already declared that this was unconstitutional, and that in spite of all Colombians' rights being recognized in the 1991 Constitution, some of the victims of internal displacement are not able to enjoy those rights because of these barriers that exist, preventing them from doing so. And we know that this reparation to the victims has been fragmented. There's been a very assistance-based approach, and there's been no differentiation made for women, different ethnic groups, or disabled people within all of this. And so we've not been able to therefore deal with these structural problems. And so we can see that there's these historic gaps when it comes to actually getting that attention and care to the victims. Even if we've got the law 1448 from 2011 that goes over and above some mere assistance and deals with collective reparation and individual reparation, the context isn't the same as it was back then in 2011, and the conflict has been ongoing since then, and there's other elements that have meant that we have to actually make that policy more relevant so that it can actually be applied to the current Colombian context. And we know that within the framework of this government's new approach, there's an actual chapter that's given over to victims within our development plan, and we need to basically overcome this unconstitutional nature of the barriers that these victims are up against. And we have to make sure that there's not just reparation given to them, but we have to make sure that we actually have a commitment on the part of the other state actors, which is what Robert Piper's underlined here. We have to be able to mobilize the rest of the state. And this has been the historic difficulties that we've had, that this might be lower down the priority list for different state organs. And I think that's one of the things that we want to do long term now in terms of reparation for the victims. There has to be this transformation in terms of the legislation, but also public policy, which is what's going to enable us to move forward, to reform and to readjust this policy that's going to be able to generate income that's diverse and that's spread out. And, you know, there has to be this constitutional core and control mechanisms that we have to be able to respond in a structural way in terms of the generation of income, so as to deal with this vulnerability and victims actually being able to enjoy their rights. The same thing happens when it comes to homes, to accommodation, you know, and the right to having a home. There's nothing that specifically materializes that for the victims. And in terms of the right of access to and being able to remain within the education system. And this is one of the elements that we've been able to identify within the public policy that have been, let's just say, the hardest to push through and the most lacking that victims associations and the Constitutional Court itself have identified. Another perspective so as to work on durable solutions from the unit that deals with justice for victims is that we have to have a focus that responds to the actual realities in every different territory in our country, which have very diverse realities. You know, one area, one community in Colombia in the highlands might be very different from those in the Caribbean region, different ethnic groups, different peasant farmer groups, and we have to meet and try and understand each one of these different contexts. And so what that means that in the case of any pilot projects, you know, that we can focus on for 4 years, we're not going to be able to, off the back of that, resolve all of the problems of the more than 9 million victims. But yeah, we do want to be able to come up with some sort of plan to immediately deal with these constitutional failings so that we can come up with something that allows us to arrive at a diagnostic of the victim situation in each of the different territories through the different facts of violence that's been perpetrated against these people, and access to education, access to electricity, access to basic services, so that we can then call upon the state bodies and the support of the United Nations, which is going to be really important, so that we can fully enter those territories, so that we can deal with this in a way that's integral and holistic. And that's obviously what we want to do with these victims, but because it is possible to deal only on a humanitarian level, but we need the participants of the communities. They need to be agents of change, agents and protagonists of the change in their regions. And that's one of the things that have come out of our lessons learned, if you like, and we want to put forward this case of an Indigenous community in the Choco region that has had massive internal displacements for more than 10 years. Those communities arrive in cities almost in a situation that they've had to beg on the streets. And what happens, you know, they don't speak even the same language as the city dwellers, you know, and there has to be an institution on the state from the state that's able to deal with this inequality, which is structural. This is something that the state has to change, and there has to be an immediate attention given and a resource put into, because we've been dealing with this the wrong way, and we could have channeled that into building them houses and dealt with this in a different way. And so with that community from the Choco region, as I've said, what we're working on now is what the actual communities themselves want. No one had actually even thought to ask them what they wanted beforehand. And so we asked them to actually, as an Indigenous people, come together as a community and basically put together their own life plan. That's to say where they want to move towards as a collective, and in this way be able to put forward solutions. And this might be the coming back to the region of different members of this community. And this has got its own complexities, but we've been working on it with different state bodies that have been able to come together in an articulated fashion, so that we'll be able to actually build those pathways so that we can deal with these structural barriers, and we can deal with this development in a way that's full and transformational. Thank you so much.
For sharing the experience from Colombia. And with that, I'm conscious of time, and we don't want to lose our audience. So I'd like to ask our last panelist, Stephanie Scharf, without further ado, who is head of the Division for Policy Issues of Displacement and Migration at the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development at BMZ, to please share with us your experience from a development actor's perspective and how you're using some of the special instruments on forced displacement and bilateral development cooperation in support of these issues. If I may ask you to keep your intervention within a manageable few minutes, that would be really appreciated. Thank you very much. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Agi, and thank you also to the other panelists and previous speakers for this very insightful debate and discussion. Of course, I also would like to commend UNDP for publishing this report at this very timely moment. It's timely, especially also for us in Germany at the BMZ, because we are also currently in the process of evaluating and re-evaluating our engagement to support IDPs and durable solutions. So, but let me start really also by highlighting our commitment to support the follow-up of the high-level panel on internal displacement, including the implementation of the action agenda. Thank you very much to Robert Piper for also presenting the main challenges and the way forward. We are fully convinced that the call to strengthen development approaches to internal displacement will benefit people in need in dire situations, but it will also contribute to social cohesion and to avoid further destabilization. So that's why this is a very important pillar of our engagement for prevention and for the implementation of the HDP nexus. As you posed in your question, I would like to shed specific light at our special instrument, the initiative on displacement, which we launched in 2014. It has a focus on supporting refugees, IDPs, and host communities with an integrated approach, valuing the principles of the HDP nexus. So from the beginning, this initiative has tried to address all groups by analyzing their specific needs, and therefore also contributing to coherent approaches leading to social cohesion and trying to avoid the further destabilization of destabilization of projected crisis situations. Around 40% of the ongoing projects within the special initiative are benefiting IDPs. By working closely with local civil society and host communities, we are also committed to the localization agenda and to our objective that projects increase local ownership for finding solutions for IDPs. Of course, also in close collaboration with the partner countries, so also echoing Robert Piper's input and especially the valuable contributions from Nigeria and Colombia for the crucial role of cooperative and collaborative approaches with host governments who have to tackle IDP crisis situations. What is important for us is that we also would like to lobby for meaningful participation as an important success factor, so that displaced people and their hosts and all their diversity are part of decision-making processes and are in the form of an accountability to affected population, also part of the finding of solutions. I especially liked also the parts of the report focusing on socioeconomic integration and support measures. We are also fully convinced that measures to support employment opportunities, education, health services, and psychosocial support create prospects and lead to stabilization, which also can contribute to finding durable solutions for IDPs, and also can contribute to advantages, for example, for the labor markets. And also very important aspect spelled out in the report. So thank you very much also for this very important analysis. So having said that, we have the special initiative. We are not starting from scratch, but still we are currently looking into what we can do more and maybe also can do different and in the German development policies approach on IDPs. So although we have invested a lot of funding, we came to the conclusion that we still have a small blind spot in our IDP response, which also leads us to the fact that we fully agree with what was said before. There is a lack of data for programming on IDP support. We have realized, and in our previous activities, very often we were not really aware of the specific needs of IDPs. So we would need also a more reliable database for a better evidence-based programming. We also would like to look more into the nexus with the climate mobility challenges. So, for example, we would like to make sure that with the newly discussed loss and damages fund as a follow-up to the COP, that questions like IDP, climate mobility, forced displacement, and also relocation is factored into the programming and the preparation of the fund. So this we would like to see as a stronger priority in our German development response. And also we would like to even put a stronger focus on the implementation of the HDP nexus in the context of IDPs. As I said before, we have been looking a lot on the humanitarian development nexus, also in cooperation with the Foreign Office and their instruments of humanitarian assistance and stabilization. But the challenge remains the peace dimension of the nexus. So this is also something we would like to analyze and put a stronger focus on in our IDP response. And also in this regard, the new UNDP report gives very valuable recommendations to us to further develop our response. So thank you very much for the report and also for this debate at the panel. And I'm looking forward to continue the exchange. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And I want to thank wholeheartedly our entire panel for sharing these experiences. And I know we can't do justice to the enormous contribution and experience that comes from our different partners. But we will continue the discussion. Of course, the report is a start that hopefully will allow us to engage more with our various partners. In the interest of time, I am going to ask Asako to take us to the end and the conclusions of this event, just to make sure that we can conclude with all of you still in the room. And then, of course, then we can continue in the break. And I wanted to acknowledge our partners from the Joint IDP Profiling Service who are also here with us. And then hopefully we can find out a little bit more once we go to the reception on our cooperation. But if you allow me, we will move to the closing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aggie, and then thank you all the participants joined here in Geneva, physically and as well as online. Apologies for prolonged the hours of the event, but this only shows that how rich that the content should be and the follow-up should be. And then I would not summarize everything that has been discussed, but just want to point out that we need the robust coalition of broader partners to drive through this agenda. This first thing, I mean, Alexandra pointed out that the addressing the data gaps, that's really has to overcome many challenges ahead. We propose the UNDP together with all the data partners to come up with the new set of data that can actually monitor progress of development solutions, so that we can inform with evidence that what will be the right the choice of the decisions and policies that needed to be taken place. At the same time, they are supporting the government nationally, locally, it will be critically important. We pointed out how important it is to have the whole of the society or whole of the government approach to it. I look forward to engaging all the partners in whether you are in the civil society, academia, or local government elsewhere. Please join in this the whole society approach. To be prepared for the climate, that is also important, as we see that we have impact already seen in the decades accumulating, but we can foresee that the number can triple in the future, so better be prepared. All of this required the coalition of partners. I would just end by repeating what the UN Secretary General has pointed out. The task now falls to all of us to deliver on the changes that are so urgently needed, and maintaining the status quo is not an option for millions of trapped in displacement. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's us work together to turn the tide on the invisible crisis that we are seeing. Thank you very much for participation, and please do join us in the reception to continue on conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.